The clerk's voice dropped to a near whisper when he slid the ledger across the counter toward Elvira Norris, and the sound of her own sharp intake of breath felt louder than a gunshot in that small, dusty land office in Caldwell, Kansas, on a Thursday morning in the spring of 1883. "Ma'am," the clerk said carefully, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles as though seeing her reaction clearly might help him survive it, "there appears to be a complication." Elvira's eyes moved down the page. Her finger traced the neat, inked lines until it stopped on a name she did not know, a name pressed into the ledger right beside hers in bold, official government script. Henry Sutton. Parcel 14B, filed 2 days prior, right alongside Parcel 14A, which was hers, her parcel, the parcel she had ridden 340 miles to claim. "This is not possible," she said, and her voice was frighteningly calm. "I'm afraid it is, Miss Norris. The Homestead Act of 1862 permits adjacent claims so long as they do not overlap. This one does not overlap. It sits precisely beside yours, sharing your northern fence line." The clerk clasped his hands together as though in prayer. "It is perfectly legal." "Who is Henry Sutton?" she asked. "A cattleman, has a large operation out of Comanche County, runs about 2,000 head. He's been trying to acquire land along the Cimarron bottomland for 2 seasons now." Elvira felt the blood drain from her face and then rush right back in, hot as a branding iron. She had spent every penny her father had left her. She had sold the furniture, the horses, everything except the one mare she'd ridden here. She had buried her father in Missouri, settled his debts with his creditors, and taken what was left, $60 and a dream he had passed to her like a lantern in a dark hallway. And she had come to this raw, wind-torn edge of the Kansas frontier to build something that was hers. And now, a cattleman had planted himself beside her like a weed between new corn. "Where is he?" she asked, already pulling on her gloves. "Ma'am, where is Henry Sutton right now?" The clerk blinked. "He filed yesterday morning. He rode back toward his cattle camp, I expect. It's about 12 miles south near the bend in the Cimarron." Elvira folded her receipt, tucked it into the inside pocket of her jacket, and fixed the clerk with a look that made him lean slightly backward. "Then I suppose I know where I'm going." She had no idea yet that in riding south toward a confrontation, she was riding toward the only person who would ever truly understand her. She had no way of knowing that Henry Sutton's hidden motive for filing that claim was not greed, but desperation, the kind of desperation built over years of secrets too heavy to carry alone. She did not yet know that by the time the first prairie wildflowers bloomed along the Cimarron, she would be fighting not to keep him out but to keep him close. But all of that was still ahead of her. Right now, all she felt was fire. She had come to Kansas in late February of 1883, which meant the prairie was still wearing its winter coat, pale gold grass bending in a cold wind, the sky enormous and gray above the flat land, the horizon so distant it felt like looking at the edge of the world. Elvira Norris was 26 years old, which was old enough to have been told repeatedly by well-meaning neighbors back in Missouri that she should have married by now, and young enough to still feel a physical fury at hearing it. She was tall for a woman of her time, lean from years of farm work, with dark auburn hair that she pinned back with a determination that matched everything else about her. Her father, Thomas Norris, had been a farmer and a dreamer in roughly equal measure. He had read every pamphlet the Department of the Interior published about the Homestead Act. He had spread them across the kitchen table and traced the roots with his finger, and told Elvira that the free land out west was not charity. It was an opportunity, and the only difference between a person who seized it and a person who did not was courage. Thomas Norris had died of pneumonia in December of 1882, 2 months before his daughter could execute the plan they had built together. He had died with the pamphlets still on the table and the dream still unfinished. Elvira had finished it for him. She had done it because she loved him and because she had no other options, and because somewhere deep beneath the grief was a hardness that refused to accept defeat. The land she had claimed, Parcel 14A, 60 acres along the south bank of the Cimarron River, was, according to the government survey maps, excellent bottomland, rich soil, good water access, sheltered by a low ridge on the western edge that would cut the worst of the winter wind. It was exactly what she needed to plant wheat and build a life, and Henry Sutton had filed a claim on the 60 acres directly north of hers. She rode south from Caldwell with the wind in her face and her jaw set like a trap. She found the cattle camp exactly where the clerk had described it, a cluster of weathered canvas tents and a wooden cook shack near the bend in the Cimarron, with maybe a dozen cowhands moving among pens and chuck wagons, and a smell of cattle that reached her a quarter-mile before she arrived. A young cowhand with a sunburned nose spotted her first and came forward to take her horse. "Help you, ma'am." "I'm looking for Henry Sutton," she said, swinging down from the saddle with the ease of someone who had been riding since she was 6. "Is he here?" "He's by the river," the young man said, pointing south. Elvira handed him the reins and walked. Henry Sutton was standing at the edge of the Cimarron with his back to her and his hat off, which was how she got a good look at him before he knew she was coming. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with dark hair that had been slightly lightened by the sun and shoulders broad enough to suggest he had spent the better part of his 31 years doing actual physical labor rather than directing other men to do it. His coat was good leather, not ostentatious but clearly made to last. He was looking at the river with an expression she could not see from behind, but something in the set of his shoulders suggested he was not at peace. She cleared her throat. He turned. His face was strong-boned and weather-tanned, with dark eyes that registered her presence with a quick, intelligent assessment that she recognized, because she did the same thing to everyone she met. There was a scar along his jaw, faint and old, and his expression was guarded in a way that made her think he was a man accustomed to not showing what he was thinking. "Henry Sutton," she said. "Yes. I'm Elvira Norris. I filed a claim on Parcel 14A yesterday morning." "You filed on Parcel 14B the day before. I'd like to know why." Something moved behind his eyes, not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it. "Miss Norris," he said, and his voice was deep and carefully neutral. "I think there may be some things you don't yet understand about this land." "Then explain them to me," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The river moved behind him, cold and brown with snowmelt, and the wind came off the water and pulled at the loose strand of hair that had escaped her pins. She did not flinch. She stood there and held his gaze with the patience of someone who had learned that blinking first cost you everything. Finally, he said, "Come sit down." She did not sit. She crossed her arms. He almost smiled. Almost. "All right, standing then." He replaced his hat and turned to face her fully. "I've been running cattle on this land for 2 years under a grazing lease. That lease ends this summer. The land goes to whoever claims it through the Homestead Act. I need the water access on that northern parcel, the 14B land, to keep my herd alive through a dry summer. Without it, I lose everything." She stared at him. "So you filed right beside me?" "Yes." "Without considering that I might have plans for that land." He held her gaze. "I didn't know you existed until this morning when the clerk mentioned your name." "And does that make it better?" she demanded. "No," he said simply. "It makes it a situation we both find ourselves in without having done anything wrong." She had not expected that answer. She had expected excuses or arrogance or the kind of dismissive condescension that men so often produced like a reflex when confronted by women who wanted things. Instead, he had looked her in the eye and told her the plain truth and acknowledged that they were both caught in the same trap set by circumstance. It disarmed her, just slightly, just enough to make her take one breath before she spoke again. "I intend to farm that land," she said. "I'm going to plant wheat. I need every inch of those 60 acres. And I intend to water my cattle," he said. "I need access to the river." They looked at each other across the cold spring air with the weight of everything at stake between them. Her dead father's dream and his struggling cattle operation, and 60 acres of Kansas bottomland that the government had decided belonged to both of them in a way that felt like neither a solution nor a joke, but something crueler than both. "We're going to have to find a way to make this work," he said finally. "We're going to have to find a way to make this work," she agreed, in a tone that made absolutely clear she considered this a declaration of war. She rode back to Caldwell that evening and lay awake in the room she'd taken at the Drovers' Hotel with the lamp burning low and her father's land pamphlet spread across the bed. She was not a woman who cried easily, but something in her chest ached with an exhaustion that went beyond the physical, the exhaustion of fighting alone, always alone, for things that should not have required a fight. She had grown up fighting. Her mother had died when Elvira was 11, and her father had done his best, but farming in Missouri in the 1870s was not a gentle life. There had been drought years and debt years and years when the crops came in fine, but the prices fell so low it amounted to the same thing. She had learned to read the weather in the color of the sky, and to read people in the color of their silence, and to trust only what she could verify with her own two hands. Henry Sutton had not looked like a dishonest man. That bothered her more than if he had. She folded the pamphlets, blew out the lamp, and made a decision. She would go back out to the land in the morning. She would see it with her own eyes. She would figure out what she was actually dealing with before she decided what to do about the man standing in the middle of it. The morning was clearer than the day before, the sky a hard, bright blue that made the prairie look like it had been newly painted. Elvira rode south from Caldwell with her saddlebags loaded with the things she'd need for a day of surveying: a compass, a notebook, a canteen, and enough dried beef and biscuits to keep her going until evening. She found the boundary markers for both parcels where the government surveyor had placed them, iron stakes driven into the soil at the four corners of each 60-acre rectangle. She walked the perimeter of her land first, all 60 acres, and what she found made her chest fill with something complicated and warm. It was beautiful. Not in the dramatic way that mountains or canyons were beautiful, but in the quiet, deeply functional way that good farmland was beautiful when you had been raised to understand it. The soil along the river bank was dark and heavy with moisture. The grass was thick even in its winter-dried state. There was a natural swale running through the middle of the parcel that would catch and hold rainwater. On the western edge, the low ridge the government map had mentioned was exactly what she'd hoped, a gentle fold in the earth that would provide shelter without blocking the sun. Her father would have wept to see it. She was writing in her notebook when she heard hoofbeats and looked up to find Henry Sutton riding toward her from the northern parcel. He was alone, which she noted. He pulled up his horse, a big bay gelding, well-kept, and looked down at her from the saddle. "You're measuring," he observed. "I'm surveying," she corrected. "There's a difference." He swung down from the horse. He had a notebook too, she noticed, tucked under his arm. They stood there for a moment, both of them on the boundary line between their two parcels, with the iron stake marking the corner between them like a mediator at a negotiation. "I want to show you something," he said. He did not ask. He stated. But there was something in his voice that made it feel less like a command and more like an invitation, which was an interesting distinction she filed away mentally. She followed him, not because she trusted him yet, but because she was curious, and curiosity had always been stronger in her than caution. He led her north across the 14B parcel to where the Cimarron curved westward in a wide, lazy bend. At the bend, the river ran slow and shallow over a gravel bar, and on the north bank a massive cottonwood had fallen across a narrow stretch, creating a natural barrier that had, over the years, built up a silted embankment on one side. "Water source," he said, pointing. "Reliable even in dry summers because the bend holds, but look here." He pointed to where the embankment on the south side, her side, had been eaten away by last spring's flooding. "The embankment on your parcel's edge is going. If it goes completely, the river's going to start cutting south, into your land." She saw it immediately. The erosion was unmistakable once you knew to look for it, the raw, crumbling edge of the bank, the undercut roots of the grass, the way the water pressed against that curve in a high-water year. "How do you know this?" she asked. "I've been watching this river for 2 years," he said. "I know every bend and every cut and every place where the water wants to go if you let it." She studied the bank. She studied him. "And you're telling me this because," he met her eyes, "because you should know what you're dealing with, and because I think if we're going to be neighbors, whether either of us likes it or not, we might as well start by being honest with each other." The word neighbors hit her with a strange double weight. She had not, until this moment, fully processed the reality that if they both held their claims, they would be living side by side for the next 5 years at minimum. The Homestead Act required 5 years of residency and improvement before the land was fully yours. 5 years of Henry Sutton's boundary line running along her northern fence. "All right," she said slowly. "What do you suggest we do about the bank?" "Stabilize it," he said. "Willow stakes and brush planted along the cut edge. It's what the old-timers call bank revetment. Costs nothing but time and work, and it saves both our parcels." She was quiet for a moment. The river moved past them, indifferent and cold. "I'll think about it," she said. She thought about it all the way back to Caldwell and all through supper at the hotel and most of the night. By morning she had made up her mind, not because Henry Sutton had charmed her, but because he had been right. She had spent enough of her life refusing good sense out of pride to know better now. She sent word to his camp that she would meet him at the riverbank at 8 o'clock the following morning to begin work on the stabilization. He was already there when she arrived, with 2 hired hands, a cart full of cut willow stakes, and a plan laid out so clearly and sensibly that she would have resented it if it had not been exactly what the situation required. They worked side by side for 3 days. There was no way to divide the work cleanly by parcel boundary because the bank ran along both their lands, so they simply worked together, driving stakes and weaving brush and laying rocks at the waterline, while the Cimarron moved past them cold and green and indifferent. The hired hands worked efficiently and said little. Henry Sutton worked harder than any of them, which she watched with a sideways attention she tried not to make obvious. On the second evening, when the hired hands had gone back to camp and she and Henry were washing the mud off their hands in a cleaner stretch of water upriver, he said, "What did you do before this?" She glanced at him. "Farmed in Missouri." "With my father." "Your father's not with you." "No," she said simply. "He died in December." Something shifted in his face, not pity, which she would have found intolerable, but something quieter, recognition. "I'm sorry," he said, and it sounded like he meant it in a way that went deeper than courtesy. She rinsed her hands and stood up. "What about you? Is there family?" A pause, a small, careful one. "No," he said, "not anymore." She did not push. She recognized a closed door when she saw one, and had too many of her own to pry at someone else's. But something had shifted between them. The silence on the walk back to her horse was different from the silence on the walk there, easier, warmer, like something that had been clenched had begun, very slightly, to open. April came with rain, which was good for the new grass and good for the planted willow stakes along the bank, and complicated for everything else. Elvira had moved out of the hotel, and into the small canvas tent she'd set up on her parcel, which was more exposed to the weather than she'd anticipated and considerably less comfortable than even the modest standards of the drover's hotel. But she needed to be on her land, living on it and working it, because the Homestead Act required it, and because she was not the kind of person who could stand in Caldwell managing something by proxy when she could be here doing it herself. She had broken the first half-acre of sod with a rented plow and a borrowed draft horse before the rains came. The work was brutal in the way that all raw land breaking was brutal. The sod was dense and matted with roots, and the plow bucked and dragged and required constant, exhausting force to keep in line. She came back to her tent every evening with her arms shaking and her back aching, and a satisfaction underneath the pain that was almost physical in its intensity. Henry's operation on the adjacent parcel was quieter. Cattle don't need plowing. They need grass and water, and the 14B land was providing both now that the bank was stabilized. She could hear the cattle sometimes at night, a low, distant sound that was oddly comforting in the enormous silence of the open prairie. He came to her tent on a Tuesday evening in the second week of April carrying a covered pot that turned out to contain beef stew and stood there at the edge of her small camp with the pot held out like a peace offering. She looked at the pot. She looked at him. "Is this a hidden motive?" she asked. He almost laughed. Almost. The corners of his eyes creased in a way that changed his face considerably. "It's supper," he said. "My cook made more than we could eat. It seemed wasteful." She took the pot. They sat on either side of her small fire and ate in a silence that had become, without either of them quite deciding it, comfortable. The stars came out above the flat Kansas landscape in their millions, unobscured by the trees or hills that would have hidden them in Missouri, and the fire was small and warm against the cold of the spring night. "You're really going to do this?" he said, not a question. "Build a farm?" "Yes." "Alone?" She looked at him steadily. "Is that remarkable?" He held her gaze. "It's not common." "Common is not what I'm aiming for," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Then you'll need help with the soddy before winter. Canvas won't hold against a Kansas December." She already knew this. "I'm aware. I have men who could spare time after the spring drive." She considered him across the fire. The flames lit the side of his face gold and left the rest in shadow, and in that light he looked less guarded than he did in daylight, or perhaps she was simply getting better at reading past the guard. "Why?" she asked. "Why what? Why offer help? You could make things difficult for me and I'd be forced to sell or abandon the claim and then you could pick it up. That would be simpler for you." He was quiet long enough that she began to wonder if she'd been wrong about him entirely. Then he said, "I could. But I won't. That's not who I am." "How am I supposed to know who you are?" she said. "I've known you for 2 weeks." "That's fair," he said. "Watch me." She did. That was the simplest summary of April. She watched him, the way she watched weather and soil, and all the things she depended on to tell the truth by their behavior over time. She watched the way he treated his hired hands fairly, which was not universal among cattlemen of the era. She watched the way he kept his word on small things, showing up when he said he would, doing what he said he'd do, and she accumulated these small data points the way she'd been taught to accumulate soil samples, waiting until she had enough to draw a conclusion. On the last Saturday of April, something happened that changed the architecture of everything. Elvira had ridden into Caldwell to collect supplies from the general store: flour, salt, lamp oil, a new hoe blade, and was loading her saddlebags in front of Hadley's dry goods when a man she did not know stepped off the wooden sidewalk and planted himself in her path. He was older than her by 15 years at least, with the kind of heavy, prosperous look that came from eating well and working rarely. He had a gold watch chain across his waistcoat and a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Miss Norris," he said, "my name is Calhoun Briggs. I represent the Consolidated Land and Cattle Trust out of Wichita. I'd like to have a word with you about your claim on the Cimarron bottomland." She did not step back. "I'm listening." "The trust is prepared to offer you $800 for parcel 14A, he said. "That's substantially above the going rate for raw homestead land." She studied him. "Why?" "The bottomland in that area has strategic value for our operations." She understood immediately. The trust wanted to consolidate large tracts of land, running cattle at the kind of scale that required control of the river access. If they could buy out both her parcel and Henry's, they would own the entire Cimarron Bend. And they were approaching her first, which meant they either considered her the weaker opponent or thought she would be more easily convinced than the established cattleman. "No," she said. The smile thinned. "Miss Norris, you're a single woman attempting to farm 60 acres without equipment, credit, or neighbors who—" "I have a neighbor," she said, "and the answer is no." She loaded her horse and rode south, and the fury that had propelled her through the whole encounter carried her all the way to the boundary of her parcel before it began to cool into something colder and more useful. Someone wanted her land. Someone with enough money to make the asking price more than 5 times what her land was worth on its own merits, which meant her land was worth far more than she'd been told, or far more to them than to her, or both. She found Henry at his camp. "Calhoun Briggs," she said without preamble. He went very still. The expression that crossed his face was something she had not seen from him before, not exactly fear, but a recognition that had darkness in it. A dark past surfacing in the present. "Where did you see him?" "Caldwell. He offered me $800 for the parcel." "What did you say?" "No, obviously." She watched him carefully. "You know him." He sat down on a crate near the cook's shack and took his hat off and ran his hand through his hair. He looked for just a moment like a man carrying something very heavy. "The Consolidated Trust has been trying to push small operators out of this area for 2 years. They nearly drove me out last year. They bought up the water rights upstream and threatened to divert during the summer. I survived it, but just barely. So they want this land. They want the whole Cimarron Bend. Our 2 parcels are the last pieces they don't control. If they get both, they have the river. If they have the river, every rancher within 20 miles either sells to them or goes under." She absorbed this. "Is that why you filed the claim? Not just for the water to keep the trust from getting it?" He met her eyes. "Yes, that's the hidden motive you were looking for. I needed the land to survive, but I also needed someone in that parcel who wasn't the trust. I didn't know it would be you. I didn't know what it would be." She was quiet for a long moment. The camp sounds went on around them, a horse moving in its picket, the cook's fire crackling, a cowhand hammering something somewhere out of sight. "So we're both fighting the same enemy," she said. "Yes. And we'd both be stronger if we were fighting together." He looked up at her, and this time the guard in his eyes was completely gone. Beneath it was something she was not yet ready to name, something raw and tired and hopeful in equal measure. "Yes," he said. "All right," she said. "Tell me everything you know about Calhoun Briggs." He told her everything that evening, and it was more than she had expected. The Consolidated Land and Cattle Trust was not simply an opportunistic land company. It had connections to several members of the Kansas state legislature, and had been using its political influence to challenge homestead claims on technical grounds. They had already driven 3 small homesteaders off adjacent parcels in the previous year by filing claims contests that alleged the homesteaders had not met the residency or improvement requirements of the act. "They could contest my claim," she said, "if I'm not careful about documentation. They'll try. You need witnesses. You need records. Every day you sleep on that land, every furrow you plow, every stake you drive, document it." She already had her notebook. She went home that night and began writing everything down with the date, and a description precise enough to hold up under legal scrutiny. She had not gone to more than 8 years of schooling, but she was the most organized person she knew, which had always served her better than formal education. May arrived with warmth and the smell of new grass, and a restless, humming energy on the prairie that felt like the land itself waking up. Elvira's first acre of broken sod was drying and turning over beautifully, and she had borrowed a harrow from a homesteader 2 miles east to break the clumps down into the fine, crumbling tilth that wheat needed. The work was endless and physical, and she had never in her life felt more purposeful. Henry came by most evenings now. Not always with food, sometimes with tools she had mentioned needing, sometimes with information about the trust's movements, once with a young border collie pup whose mother had died whelping and who needed someone to look after her. Elvira named the pup Clara, and the pup immediately installed herself as an authority on the camp. She and Henry talked for longer each evening. The conversations had shifted from the practical to the personal in the gradual, almost unnoticed way that conversations do when 2 people are running out of reasons to stay guarded. She learned that he had grown up in Tennessee, had come west at 18 with 2 older brothers and a plan that had not survived contact with reality. One brother had died of fever in the Indian Territory. The other had gone back east and was currently selling insurance in Memphis, a fact Henry reported with a dry humor that made her smile. She told him about her mother. She had not talked about her mother in years. It was one of those griefs that had become so familiar it was almost invisible, like a stone in your boot that you stop noticing until someone points it out. But she told him about Elvira Norris, who had been small and dark-haired and ferociously good at growing vegetables in poor soil, and who had taught Elvira to read using a Bible and a copy of David Copperfield that she'd carried from Kentucky when she married. "She sounds like someone I would have liked to know," Henry said. "She was someone everyone liked," Elvira said. "She was the kind of person who made the world feel safer just by being in it." He was quiet after that, in the good way, the way that meant he was sitting with what she'd said rather than rushing past it. On a clear evening in the middle of May, when the first blush of new wheat was just beginning to show across her plowed acre like the faintest green shadow on the soil, he said, without any preamble, "I'd like to court you." She had been expecting it, the way you expect a storm you've been watching build for days. You're not surprised by the lightning, but you still feel the electricity of it. She set down the tin mug she was holding and looked at him. "That's a serious thing to say," she said. "I'm a serious person." "So am I, which is why I'm going to ask you directly, what do you actually want? A partner in fighting the trust? A wife to help secure your claim? Or do you mean what you're saying?" He held her gaze through all of it. "I mean what I'm saying. The rest is complications. This is separate." She picked up her mug. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded, which was the right response. He did not push. He did not explain or justify or try to convince her. He simply accepted that she needed time and gave it to her, which was, she reflected later, one of the most convincing arguments in his favor. She thought about it for 2 days. She thought about it while plowing and while cooking, and while lying in her tent listening to the nighthawks cry over the dark prairie. She thought about who she was and what she wanted, and whether it was possible to want something for its own sake in the middle of a life that demanded everything for practical reasons. She had been self-sufficient since she was 11 years old. She had built every important thing she had with her own 2 hands, and she had survived every loss by simply refusing to stop moving. She did not need Henry Sutton. She needed to decide whether she wanted him. She went to his camp on the 3rd evening after he'd asked. He was sitting at the camp table going over his accounts by lamplight, and he looked up when she came in. "Yes," she said. He set down his pen. Slow, genuine smile crossed his face, the first full smile she had seen from him, and it transformed him in a way that made her breath catch. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "I'm not easy." "I noticed," he said. "That doesn't put you off." "On the contrary," he said. She sat down across from him, and the lamp between them made a small, warm world of light in the cool Kansas night, and for the first time since Missouri she did not feel entirely alone. June was transformation. On both parcels and between the 2 of them. Her wheat was up thin green lines across the dark soil, impossibly fragile-looking and impossibly resilient, the way new things always are. She had a proper garden bed going too, with early peas and beans and the beginnings of a kitchen garden that would carry her through the summer. She was moving her camp toward the western edge of her parcel, near the low ridge, where she planned to build her soddy, the sod house that would be her permanent home. Henry brought his men on a Saturday in early June, as he'd promised months ago, and they spent the day cutting blocks of sod from the less useful eastern edge of his parcel, and stacking them according to the method that prairie homesteaders had used since the first settlers arrived in the 1850s. The walls went up layer by layer, each block laid grass side down, the dense root matrix of the prairie grass creating a natural binding agent that held better than mortar in a dry climate. Elvira worked alongside his men all day, and Henry worked beside her. By evening they had 3 walls to 4 feet high, and she stood back and looked at the beginning of her house with a feeling too large and complex to name. "By next Saturday we'll have the roof frame up," Henry said, standing beside her. She turned and looked up at him. She was tall, but he was taller, and she was not accustomed to looking up at people, which made it feel like something small and significant. "You've been very good to me," she said. "You've earned it," he said. "You're good at receiving help without losing yourself in it." She thought about that. Is that a rare quality? In anyone, he said. Rarer in people who have had to be as self-sufficient as you. They were standing close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes and the way the late sun caught the gray that was just beginning at his temples. He was 31 and she was 26, and they had known each other for barely 3 months, and she was surprised to find that none of those facts felt like obstacles. He reached up and moved a strand of hair that the wind had blown across her face, and the touch was so brief and careful that it could not even be called a touch, really, just a shadow of contact at her temple, and yet she felt it for hours afterward. The first real threat from the trust came in the second week of June. A rider arrived at her camp on a Monday morning with a legal document in a sealed envelope, a formal claim contest filed with the Kansas Land Office by the Consolidated Land and Cattle Trust, alleging that Elvira Norris had failed to establish bona fide residency on Parcel 14A and had not made the improvements required by the Homestead Act within the specified time period. She read the document twice. Her hands were steady. Her mind was working. The allegations were false. She had been living on and improving her land since April, but proving it against a company with legal resources she didn't have was a different problem from simply being right. She rode to Henry's camp. He read the document in silence, his expression going very still and focused in the way she'd come to recognize as his thinking face. "They'll file the same against me within the week," he said. "They've done this before. They file simultaneously to overwhelm the responses. Who's the government land agent who handles these contests? A man named Hargrove. He's out of the district office in Wichita." "Is he honest?" Henry was quiet for a moment. "I think so. He ruled against the trust on the Adams parcel last year, which cost him politically." "Then I want to go to Wichita," she said. "I want to sit across from Hargrove and put my documentation on his desk and make my case in person." "So do I," Henry said. "You'll go?" "Of course I'll go. We're in this together, Elvira." It was the first time he had used her given name without the formality of Miss Norris, and she noticed it the way she noticed everything, quietly, completely, and with it stored. They rode to Wichita together on Wednesday, which was a full day's ride north on the Kisham Trail Road. They rode side by side through the flat summer prairie, the sky enormous above them and the grass long and moving in the steady south wind, and they talked about the land, about the trust, about Kansas politics and the particular injustice of a system that was simultaneously designed to give ordinary people access to land, and so easily weaponized by wealth to take it back from them. "The Homestead Act was a good idea imperfectly executed," Henry said. "It assumed good faith from all parties." "Good faith is not a natural resource that corporations are rich in," she said. He glanced at her sidelong and she caught the look. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I just like the way you think." She looked forward at the road. "Stop it," she said, but she was smiling. They stayed in Wichita at separate lodgings, she at the Continental House on Douglas Avenue and he at the Cary Hotel 2 blocks away, because she was not going to give the trust or anyone else ammunition to challenge her reputation on top of everything else, and because she was Elvira Norris and she had her own standards regardless of what anyone else might do. The meeting with District Land Agent Howard Hargrove was at 10 o'clock Thursday morning. Hargrove was a precise, dry-mannered man in his 50s, with the look of someone who had been lied to by every category of person, and had consequently developed a powerful appreciation for evidence. Elvira put her documentation on his desk, her dated notebook, the sworn affidavits she'd collected from the Caldwell clerk and from a neighboring homesteader, and from one of Henry's hired hands who had worked alongside her on the bank's stabilization, and she stated her case without embellishment or emotion. Hargrove read everything in silence. He asked 3 questions. He made 2 notes. He looked up. "The trust's contest appears to be based on their assertion that no permanent structure existed on the parcel," he said. "You have here a photograph." He held up the image she had taken at the Sadi's construction, through a traveling photographer who had come through Caldwell in June, showing substantial construction in progress, dated by the photographer and witnessed. "Yes, sir," she said, "and sworn statements placing you on the property continuously since April." "Yes, sir." Hargrove looked at Henry. "Your situation is similar. Similar documentation," Henry said. "And I can add that the riverbank stabilization we undertook jointly in April represents a substantial capital improvement to both parcels." Hargrove set the documents down. "I'll need 2 weeks to process the formal response. The contest hearing will be set at the district court in Caldwell. I cannot promise you the outcome, but I can tell you that the evidence you've provided today is substantially stronger than what the trust typically faces in these proceedings." He paused. "I'll say this plainly. The trust has filed 11 contest proceedings in this district in the past 18 months. They've won 4 of them. The 7 they lost were the ones where the homesteaders had their paperwork in order. You do." It was the most encouraging news she'd had in months. She walked out of the federal building onto the Wichita Street with Henry beside her and the June sun warm on her face and something that felt dangerously close to hope rising in her chest. Henry stopped on the sidewalk and looked at her. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Cautiously optimistic," she said, "which is as good as it gets with me." He smiled. The full smile, the one that changed his face. "Shall we celebrate? There's a hotel restaurant on Main Street that's said to be the best in Kansas." She considered him. "Are you asking me to have dinner with you, Henry Sutton?" "I am," he said, "in a public restaurant. In a public restaurant in the middle of the day in full view of anyone who cares to look," he said, "which I expect will be no one of consequence." She took his arm. "All right," she said. The restaurant was good by any standard, white tablecloths, actual china, a menu that included items she had not eaten since Missouri, and a bottle of wine that Henry ordered with the casualness of someone who had made such choices before, but did so without ostentation. They ate and talked, and the conversation moved from the practical to the personal to the philosophical and the natural, easy current that their conversations had developed since April, and somewhere in the middle of the second course she realized that she was happy. Simply, uncomplicatedly happy in a way she could not remember feeling since before her father's illness. She set down her fork. She looked at him. He looked back. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right." "I'm not easy to know," she said. "I think you know that. But I want you to know that I'm very glad you filed that claim on 14B. I'm very glad you were standing at the river when I came looking for you. I wouldn't have chosen this route to whatever this is, but I'm glad it's the route I ended up on." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His hand was warm and large and work-roughened, and he held hers with the particular combination of gentleness and certainty that she had come to associate with everything he did. "I'm glad, too," he said. She turned her hand over and held his back. They rode home from Wichita on Friday with the wind in their faces and a new quality between them. Something that had been shifting and uncertain had clicked into a kind of quiet, settled clarity. They were in love. Neither of them said it yet, but it was there, as solid and factual as the land they rode back to. July brought heat, and the trust's court contest, and the green wheat growing toward the sky in rows so straight they made her proud every morning she looked at them. The hearing in Caldwell was scheduled for the 3rd Tuesday of July. In the 10 days before it, Elvira organized her evidence with military precision, writing out the chronology of her residence and improvement in a clean hand, and numbering every supporting document and cross-referencing them with dates. Henry did the same for his parcel, and they sat at her camp table several evenings going over each other's materials, finding gaps and filling them, arguing productively about which evidence was strongest and how to present it. "You should lead with the photograph," he said one evening. "It's the most immediately visual evidence of improvement, and it's dated by a credible third party." "I was going to open with the residency affidavits," she said. "Start with what they can see, then give them the paperwork to confirm what they already believe." She considered this. "That's actually good. I have good ideas occasionally." "Don't overstate it," she said, and he laughed, a real, unconstrained laugh that she had been working to produce since April and that she received now like a prize. Clara the border collie put her head in Elvira's lap, demanding attention, and the evening went on in the warm lamplight with the summer prairie dark and full of cricket song outside. The hearing was before a circuit judge named Caldwell, who was unrelated to the town and who had a reputation for strict adherence to legal procedure, which worked in their favor since the trust's case rested largely on innuendo about the practical impossibility of a woman farming alone, rather than any specific factual challenge to her improvements. The trust's lawyer, a sharp-featured man from Wichita named Prescott, made his arguments with practiced smoothness, and Elvira sat at the table opposite and listened to every word and felt the fury rise and fall in her like a tide she had long since learned to control. He said, in the refined language of legal argument, that she was not a credible homesteader, that her claim was speculative, that her improvements were insufficient and her residency intermittent. When it was her turn, she placed her documentation on the judge's bench one piece at a time, clearly, calmly, and in the order she had decided on. She answered every question directly. She did not hedge or qualify or apologize for any of it. When the judge asked her whether she believed she could successfully farm this land to the standard required by the Homestead Act, she said, "I have already begun, Your Honor. The wheat currently growing on Parcel 14A and the structural improvements already completed and documented speak for themselves." The judge ruled in her favor that afternoon. He ruled in Henry's favor the following morning. The trust's contests were dismissed. Hargrove's office sent formal notifications within the week confirming both claims. She was sitting on the low ridge on the western edge of her parcel when Henry found her that evening, sitting in the long summer grass with Clara at her side, and the wheat a gold-green shimmer in the late light, and the sky turning shades of pink and orange and deep blue that no painter had yet managed to capture accurately. He sat down beside her without asking which was correct. For a while neither of them spoke. The evening settled around them, warm and golden and enormous. "It's ours," she said quietly. "Yes," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. It was the first time she had done anything like it, and it felt natural, the way things feel natural when they've been slowly, carefully building toward inevitability for months. His arm came around her. Carefully, firmly, like a man who had thought about this and meant it. "Elvira," he said, "don't say anything that will ruin this," she said. "I was going to say I love you." She was very still. "I know it's too fast and I know you need time for things, and I'm not asking you to say it back if you're not ready," he said, with a steadiness that she recognized as costing him something. "But I want you to know." She sat up and looked at him. His face in the last gold light was open and earnest and more vulnerable than she had ever seen it, and she felt something that was past language, a clear, singing certainty that moved through her like the first warm day after a long winter. "I love you too," she said. "I'm not good at waiting to say things once I know they're true." He looked at her with everything unguarded. Then he cupped her face in his hands, those warm, work-roughened, careful hands, and kissed her, and the prairie evening went on around them, indifferent and beautiful and enormous, and she thought that this was what her father had meant when he spread the pamphlets on the table and called it an opportunity. Not just the land, all of it. August was the hardest month. The wheat came in needing to be harvested before the rains that the almanac and every experienced farmer in the county predicted for the first week of September, and she did not have the equipment to do it alone. A wheat harvest required a reaper or an enormous amount of hand labor, and while her acre was modest enough that it was feasible by hand, it would take days she could not spare. Henry provided the reaper. It was the horse-drawn mechanical type that had become increasingly common on the prairie in the 1880s, and it cut her wheat in a morning. His hired hands shocked the cut grain into the standing bundles that would dry before thrashing, and she worked alongside them, moving fast and efficiently, And when they were done, she sat on the wagon's running board and looked at the acre of shocked wheat standing gold in the afternoon light, and felt something enormous and quiet settle in her chest. She sold the wheat through a grain buyer in Caldwell who came out to assess the harvest. The price was not remarkable. Wheat prices had been under pressure in Kansas since the early 1880s as production expanded. But it was money, real money, and combined with the kitchen garden she'd been preserving all summer, she would go into winter with more security than she'd had since Missouri. She paid Henry's hired hands for their reaping time. She made sure of it. She would not have it said by anyone that she had taken anything she had not paid for. She and Henry had their first real argument in September. It was about the fence. Henry needed a fence along the northern boundary of her parcel to keep his cattle from wandering onto her planted ground. She agreed with the fence. The argument was about who would build it. She said she would build half since it was her boundary too. He said he had the men and the materials already, and it made no sense for her to duplicate effort when there was other work to be done on her parcel. She said she was not going to be managed. He said he was not managing her. He was making a practical suggestion. She said that practical suggestions from someone with more resources than you had a way of becoming obligations that were not always visible at the time. He was very quiet. Then he said, "That's not who I am." "I know," she said after a moment. "I know you're not doing it that way intentionally, but I need you to understand why I feel it." He was quiet again, this time the thinking quiet, because you've been doing everything yourself for so long that any help feels like it has strings. Yes, even from someone who loves you. Especially from someone who loves me, she said, because with other people I can walk away, with you I can't. He sat with that for a long time. Then, "Tell me how you want to do the fence." They did the fence together, splitting the labor evenly, which took longer and was less efficient and felt entirely right to both of them. The soddy was finished by October. A solid, well-made sod house with 2 rooms, a proper wood floor Henry's men had laid, a stone hearth they'd built together, and windows she'd ordered from the Caldwell hardware store, glass being one of the small extravagances she had decided were worth the cost. The walls were 18 inches of dense sod, which meant the house would be warm in winter and cool in summer, and she moved her camp things inside with a ceremony so private and personal it was conducted in silence, alone, early on an October morning before anyone else was awake. She sat on the floor of her finished house and looked at the firelight reflecting off the glass of the windows and thought of her father, and she cried, which she almost never did. She cried for him and for her mother, and for the years of scraping and hoping and the long road from Missouri, and she let herself feel all of it completely because she knew the feeling would pass and leave her lighter when it did. Then she got up, dried her face, and went to start breakfast. Henry proposed in November. He did it without ceremony, which was right for them. They were walking the perimeter of his parcel on a cold, gray afternoon. He had a habit of walking his land periodically to check on the cattle and the grass and the water access, and she had started joining him sometimes, and he simply stopped walking and turned to face her. "Marry me," he said. She looked at him. "Is that how you're asking?" "Marry me, please," he said. "I love you. I want to build a life beside you. I want to argue with you about fences and work through problems with you and sit by your fire in the evenings for the rest of my life. Marry me." The wind came off the Cimarron and moved through the dry winter grass, and above them the sky was the deep, cold gray of a November Kansas afternoon, and she felt completely, perfectly certain. "Yes," she said. They were married in December at the Caldwell Methodist Church, which was a small, plain building on the edge of town that nonetheless filled up remarkably well for a Thursday afternoon. Henry's handful of long-time hired hands came, and the neighboring homesteaders, the Bradleys from 2 miles east and the Hartman family from a mile south, came, and Hargrove from the Wichita land office came, and the Caldwell clerk came, which she had not expected and which moved her considerably. She wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool that she had made herself in Missouri, and which was good enough to serve the occasion without being frivolous. She had done her hair carefully and wore her mother's small gold earrings, which were the only piece of jewelry she owned, and which she had carried from Missouri in the inside pocket of her jacket, alongside the land claim receipt and the survey map. Henry stood at the front of the church and looked at her when she walked in with the kind of expression that a man wears when he is looking at something he knows will change his life, and is entirely willing to let it. The minister was brief and sincere, and the ceremony was simple, which was what they had asked for. When they said the words, they looked at each other with steady, clear-eyed certainty, and when Henry lifted her hand and placed the plain gold band on her finger, she felt the weight of it as an anchor and a freedom simultaneously, which was the paradox she would spend the rest of her life turning over and finding new dimensions in. They walked out of the church into the cold December air as Mr. and Mrs. Henry Sutton, except that she kept Norris alongside it, hyphenating her name in her own mind and in her records and in the land claim documentation, because Elvira Norris was who she had arrived as and who she intended to remain, and Henry had never once suggested otherwise. Winter on the Cimarron was exactly as brutal as everyone had said it would be. The temperature dropped to levels that felt hostile and personal, and the wind came off the open plains with nothing between them and the Arctic to slow it down. The soddy proved its worth inside, with the stone hearth going. The thick sod walls held warmth in a way that a wooden frame house would not have managed. They had combined their operations in a practical way. Henry moved into the soddy with her, while his men wintered in the bunkhouse at his camp, and they managed both parcels from her base on 14A, which was more centrally located relative to the water access and the cattle operation. It was a decision that made practical sense, and that also meant they learned the rhythms of living together in the way that only actual cohabitation can teach you, with all its small negotiations and discoveries. He learned that she woke early and needed quiet before coffee. She learned that he could not go to sleep without reading for at least half an hour, and maintained a small but serious collection of books that he treated as his most valuable possessions after his cattle. He learned that she was methodical to the point of being occasionally rigid about certain processes, and had to be gently challenged rather than directly contradicted. She learned that he had a temper that was slow to rise but considerable when it arrived, and that the best response was to give him 20 minutes and then talk through whatever it was with the same directness she brought to everything else. They were, in the fundamental sense, good for each other. They complemented each other's strengths in ways neither of them had anticipated and challenged each other's limitations with the affectionate relentlessness of people who are invested enough in each other to bother. January brought Calhoun Briggs back. He came to their door in person this time, which she had not expected, and which told her something about the trust's desperation. Henry answered the door, and Briggs stood on the soddy's low step in his expensive coat with his gold watch chain and his unsuccessful smile, and offered them $4,000 for both parcels combined. Elvira stepped up beside Henry in the doorway. Briggs's eyes moved to her and then away in the dismissive way that some men had, and she felt Henry's hand close around hers. "No," Henry said. "The offer won't improve," Briggs said. "The trust is prepared to pursue every available legal remedy to Mr. Briggs," Elvira said, cutting through cleanly. "You have already pursued your available legal remedies. The district court found them insufficient. Agent Hargrove found your contest frivolous. We have 5 years of residency required by law ahead of us, and we intend to complete them. And at the end of them, this land will be ours by full title with no further leverage for the trust to apply. So whatever you came here to threaten us with today, I suggest you think carefully about whether it's worth the horse ride." Briggs stared at her. Something moved behind his eyes, not quite respect, but perhaps the particular discomfort of a man who has underestimated someone and is being forced to acknowledge it. "Good afternoon, Mr. Briggs," Henry said, and closed the door. There was a moment of silence in the soddy. Then Elvira turned and walked to the kitchen table and sat down and put her hands flat on the wood and took 2 controlled breaths. "Are you all right?" Henry asked. "I'm excellent," she said. "I just want to sit here for a moment." He sat across from her. Clara the border collie came and put her head in his lap, ignoring the domestic politics entirely. "He won't come back," Henry said. "Not in person. If they have another legal play, we'll hear it through the courts." "I know," she said. "But even if they do, Henry, we're going to win. I'm sure of it. Not because we're lucky or because we're powerful, but because we're right and we're documented and we're not going anywhere." He looked at her across the table. "I know," he said softly. "I've known that since October." "October," she said. "When you moved into the house, I watched you through the window that morning. I didn't mean to spy, I just happened to be walking by, and you were sitting on the floor by yourself looking around the room with this expression that I'll remember for the rest of my life. Like you'd found something you'd been looking for so long you'd half stopped believing it existed." She stared at him. Something in her throat was doing something complicated. "You saw that?" "I went back to my camp and I thought, whatever comes next, whatever the trust tries, whatever the weather does, she is not leaving that house. She is not leaving that land. And any fight that has her in it is a fight worth having." She stood up and went around the table and put her arms around him from behind, pressing her cheek against the back of his head, and he reached up and held her forearms with both hands. "I love you," she said. "Even when I'm not saying it, I love you." "I know," he said. "I love you too." February of 1884 brought news that the Trust's parent company in Wichita had run into significant financial trouble, overextended on land purchases, and facing creditor pressure, which had a contracting effect on their operational capacity. Hargrove sent a note through the Caldwell Land Office informing them that the Trust's pending legal actions in the district had been suspended pending reorganization. It was not quite victory, but it was something very close to the removal of the central threat, and Elvira spread the note flat on the kitchen table and read it 3 times, and then set it aside and started planning the spring planting. Spring of 1884 was bigger than the year before. She had 2 acres under plow now, the wheat acre from last year and a new acre she'd broken over the winter during the brief thawed periods, and a kitchen garden twice the size of the previous years, and a small chicken operation she'd started in October with a dozen hens purchased from the Bradleys, and which had proven enthusiastically productive. Henry had increased his herd modestly, buying 12 additional head from a rancher in Comanche County who was reducing his operation, and the combination of the river access and the good bottomland grass had brought the cattle through the winter in excellent condition. They were building something real, something that worked. She discovered she was expecting in March, and she sat with the knowledge alone for a day before she told Henry, not because she was uncertain about sharing it, but because she wanted to fully inhabit the knowledge herself first, to feel all the dimensions of it, the joy and the weight and the particular, solemn responsibility of it, before she let it become something shared. She told him in the evening by the fire. He went very still. Then he looked at her with an expression so open and unguarded that it was almost difficult to meet it. His eyes were bright in a way she had never seen before. "Are you well?" he asked. "I'm perfectly well," she said. "It's early. February, I think, is when the baby should come." She had done the arithmetic carefully. He stood up and crossed to her and took her face in his hands, the way he had that first evening in May when he'd kissed her, and he held her there and looked at her with everything he had. "Elvira," he said. "Don't you start," she said, because she could see the emotion in his face and she was not entirely sure she could hold herself together if he cried, which she had never seen him do and which would absolutely undo her. He did not cry, but he held her for a long time. The summer of 1884 was their second summer, and it was richer in every way than the first. The wheat came in better, more acres, better management, better timing. The kitchen garden produced abundantly. The chickens were absurdly productive, and she had begun selling eggs to the Caldwell Hotel, which was a small but reliable income stream. Henry's cattle operation was running smoothly with the river access secured and the pasture land on 14B in good condition. They had built a real partnership, not just the romantic partnership of two people in love, but the working partnership of two people who shared a piece of the earth and were responsible for making it productive. They divided the labor according to capacity and preference rather than convention, which meant that she often made decisions about the cattle access schedule that in other arrangements would have been his domain, and he often helped with the food preservation and the household management that in other arrangements would have been hers, and neither of them found this remarkable. The Bradleys from 2 miles east became genuine friends. Marta Bradley was a German immigrant who had come to Kansas 5 years before and knew more about prairie farming than almost anyone else Elvira had met, and they had an exchange of seeds and knowledge and labor that was the frontier economy at its best. The trust's reorganization in Wichita was completed over the summer, and what emerged was a smaller, more cautious entity that had significantly less appetite for the kind of legal aggression that had characterized the earlier version. Calhoun Briggs disappeared from the Kansas frontier as thoroughly as if he had never existed, and the 10 remaining homesteaders whose claims the trust had been contesting found themselves suddenly free of pressure. It was not justice exactly. No one had been compensated for the harassment and the legal costs and the sleepless nights, but it was resolution, and resolution was what they had. September brought Henry's brother. She had not known about the brother, not the full story. Henry had mentioned him once, the insurance salesman in Memphis, and she had not pressed. But a letter arrived in September from Memphis, and Henry read it at the breakfast table with an expression that told her everything she needed to know about the complexity of the relationship before he said a word. "William wants to come visit," he said. "Then he should come," she said. "It's not simple," Henry said. He put the letter down. He looked at her. She waited. "William and I parted badly when we left Tennessee. He wanted to go back east after our brother died, and I wanted to stay west, and we said things to each other that were not charitable. People say things in grief," she said. "Yes, but these were specific things about specific choices, and some of them were true, which made them worse." She set down her coffee cup. "What choices?" He was quiet for a long moment. She recognized the quality of this particular silence. This was the one that preceded something he had been carrying alone for a long time. "Before I came to Kansas," he said, "when we were in the Indian Territory, there was a conflict with a Comanche cattle drive that went wrong. Our brother was involved. The injustice of it, the way the cattle were taken, the way the land rights were disregarded, the way the men involved were simply, it was wrong. And I didn't stop it because I was young and afraid, and there was no power in me to stop it. And James died 2 months later, and I have never been entirely sure that those two things were unconnected." She listened to all of it. "William blamed me," Henry said. "He said I was as culpable as the men who acted directly. And he stopped. I didn't disagree with him. I disagreed with the timing of the accusation, but not with the substance." "Henry," she said gently. He looked at her. "What happened to the Comanche men who were wronged? Is there anything that can be done?" He shook his head slowly. "It was 6 years ago. The men involved are scattered. The cattle are long gone. There's no legal remedy." He paused. "But I know who the territory agent was, and I know what he documented versus what actually occurred. There are records," she nodded slowly. "That might not fix what was done, but it's something." He reached across the table and took her hand. "You're not going to tell me it wasn't my fault, that I was young. I'm not going to tell you a thing that you don't already believe yourself," she said. "But I'm going to say that the man who sat on a crate in a cattle camp and told me there was no comfortable hidden truth he was trying to sell me, that man is not someone who is content with himself, which is different from being a bad person. It's being a person who's working at it." He squeezed her hand. "Write to William," she said. "Let him come." William Sutton arrived in October, 4 weeks before the baby was due, and he was recognizably Henry's brother, same height, same dark coloring, though lighter in his manner, quicker to smile, with the ease of a man who had been living in a city and moving in social circles for a decade. He was 34 and had a wife named Catherine who had stayed in Memphis with their 2 children, but he'd come west himself, he said, to see what Henry had built and to try to say the things that needed saying. The first evening was careful and measured. William was courteous to Elvira in a way that told her he was genuinely trying. She cooked a good supper and was direct in her conversation, and did not perform any version of herself that was softer or easier than the real one. And by the end of the evening, William had relaxed enough to be actually present rather than just politely so. On the second day, Henry and William went for a long walk along the Cimarron while Elvira stayed back and organized the baby preparations. She had been sewing and collecting for weeks, building up the stores of small garments and bedding and the other necessaries, and when they came back from their walk, both brothers were quieter than they'd been when they left, in the good way. "I think it went well," Henry said that evening when they were alone. "I know it did," she said. "You both looked lighter." "He's a good man," Henry said. "He was always a good man. He was just right about something I wasn't ready to hear." "The best apologies are the ones that don't require the other person to pretend they were wrong," she said. He looked at her with the expression she loved most on his face, the one that meant she'd articulated something he'd felt but not found words for. William stayed for 2 weeks and left for Memphis with a handshake for Henry that turned into something briefer and more meaningful, and with a genuine warmth for Elvira that had not been present at the start. He said, as he mounted his horse in the cold October morning, that Catherine would like very much to correspond with Elvira, which Elvira received as the high compliment it was intended to be. "He liked you," Henry said, watching his brother ride north toward the Caldwell Road. "Of course he did," Elvira said. The baby arrived on the 4th of February, 1885, in the Soddy on Parcel 14A, during a Kansas winter night so cold that the breath of the women attending, Marta Bradley and the Bradleys' eldest daughter Lisbeth, who was 17 and steady-handed, made clouds in the air of the room. Henry was outside for much of it, because that was how it was done, and because she had explicitly told him she did not need him to witness her struggle when she was entirely capable of handling it with the help of the women present. But when it was over and Marta opened the door and said, "Mr. Sutton, come in," he came in with snow on his coat and fear still leaving his face, and she held up the child, a boy, red-faced and enormously loud about his opinions, and said, "He looks like himself," which was all she could think of to say. Henry crossed the room and she put the boy in his arms and watched his face do something entirely new. They named him Thomas after her father. Henry had suggested it without prompting and she had said yes immediately, and then had to look out the window for a while. Thomas Henry Sutton Norris was a vigorous, demanding, spectacularly healthy infant who announced his needs at considerable volume, and regarded the world with the specific alert suspicion of a person who is taking everything in and forming opinions about it. He had Henry's dark hair and her eyes, and a temperament that appeared to be a synthesis of both his parents in their less restrained moments. The spring of 1885 was their 3rd spring on the Cimarron, and it was the fullest yet. Elvira worked the farm in the mornings while Marta Bradley came to sit with Thomas, and in the afternoons she brought him with her in the Indian-style carrier board she'd learned to make from a Kiowa woman she'd traded with at the Caldwell market the previous summer, and he regarded the wheat fields and the chicken yard and the river bank with equal scientific interest from his elevated position. Henry had hired 2 additional hands and was expanding the cattle operation cautiously, with an eye toward making it sustainable rather than simply large. He had also quietly sent what documentation he had about the Indian Territory incident to a government land office in Kansas City, not expecting much to come of it but doing it because it was the honest thing to do. He had told Elvira about it the morning he sent it, simply and without drama. "Good," she said. "You're not surprised?" "No," she said. "I'm not surprised." The trust's reorganized successor company made one final approach in the spring of 1885, not Briggs this time, but a younger man who presented himself as a land development consultant and offered a thoroughly reasonable price for both parcels. They declined, pleasantly and finally, and the man rode back to Caldwell, and they never heard from the Consolidated Trust or its successors again. The years that followed built upon each other in the way that good years do, not without difficulty, because difficulty was simply the condition of living and working on the frontier, but with a sense of forward progress that accumulated into something solid and real. In the fall of 1886, they broke ground on a proper wooden frame house on the western edge of the combined property, not to replace the soddy, which remained useful as a storage and workspace, but to give their growing family the space it needed. Henry had saved for 2 years for the lumber, which had to be freighted from Wichita, and the construction was done with the help of neighboring homesteaders in the cooperative tradition of the prairie, with the Bradleys and the Hartmans and 2 other families from the area contributing labor in exchange for the same when the time came. The house had 4 rooms on the ground floor and 2 bedrooms above, and Elvira designed the kitchen herself, which was the largest room on the ground floor and had windows on 2 sides and a wood stove and a long workbench along one wall and shelves that ran from floor to ceiling. It was, in her opinion, the finest room she had ever been in. Thomas was 2.5 by the time the house was finished, and he took immediate ownership of the yard outside, which he regarded as a wilderness to be explored and cataloged with the methodical intensity that would later translate into an adult capacity for patience that Elvira would always feel was more Henry than herself, and an independence that Henry would always feel was more Elvira than himself. Their daughter, Elvira, named for Elvira's mother, arrived in the spring of 1888, which was their 5th year on the Cimarron, the year their homestead land grants became full title by operation of the Homestead Act's 5-year requirement. Elvira filed the final paperwork herself, in person, at the Caldwell Land Office, with Elvira 6 weeks old and asleep against her chest in the carrier, and Thomas holding her hand with the serious deportment of a 4-year-old who understands that something important is happening. The clerk, a different clerk from the one who had shown her the ledger 5 years before, but similar in his wire-rimmed spectacles and careful manner, stamped the final certificate and handed it across the counter, and she took it with both hands and felt the weight of it as something finished, something completed and whole. She walked out into the Caldwell Street in the spring morning and stood in the light with her daughter sleeping against her heart and her son beside her and the certificate in her hands, and she thought about a woman who had ridden into this office 5 years ago with $60 and a dream, and a fury so clean it could have cut glass. Henry was waiting outside with the horses. She walked to him and held up the certificate. He looked at it, and then at her face, and then, in the middle of the Caldwell Street on a March morning in 1888 with their children and their horses and 5 years of frontier life behind them, he kissed her in full public view of anyone who cared to look. She kissed him back. Thomas made a face and said "Papa" in a tone of profound embarrassment which made both his parents laugh. That evening they ate supper in the new house, a big supper, one of the good ones that Elvira made on occasions that deserved it, with beef and bread and the preserved vegetables from the cellar and a dried apple pie. And after the children were in bed, they sat by the fire in the good chairs Henry had ordered from a furniture maker in Wichita the previous fall, with a cup of coffee each and the final title certificates on the table between them, one for 14A and one for 14B, 5 years. He said, 5 years, she agreed. She looked at the certificates. We actually did it. Did you ever doubt it? She considered the honest answer. In the winter of the first year in February, when the temperature was 20 below for 4 days in a row, and the chickens nearly died and the river froze to the bottom, and I thought maybe I'd miscalculated. Maybe the dream was more than the reality. "What changed?" he asked. "The temperature went up," she said. He laughed. The firelight moved across his face, and the house around them was warm and solid and real. The house they had built on the land they had fought for on the frontier they had come to not knowing what they'd find. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me." "When I rode into Caldwell 5 years ago, I was certain that everything I needed to do, I would do alone. I had planned for alone. I had built myself for alone." She looked at him. "And then I found your name in the ledger and I was furious, and I rode south to fight you, and I found you at the river, and you were ready for a war," he said gently. "And I was ready for a war," she said. "And you told me the truth instead. And that was the thing I had not planned for. I had planned for every kind of dishonesty, but not for that particular honesty." He reached across the arm of the chair and took her hand. "What are you saying?" he asked softly. "I'm saying that the best thing I ever did was file that claim. And the second best thing I ever did was ride south to fight the man who'd filed beside me." He raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, old-fashioned and deliberate, in the way that he sometimes marked moments, quietly, completely. "The best thing I ever did," he said, "was be there when you arrived." The Cimarron moved past their land that night and every night thereafter, cold and reliable and uninterested in the human stories along its banks. The wheat grew and the cattle grazed, and the children grew with a speed that seemed, to their parents, to be the most remarkable and slightly alarming thing about them. Thomas at 4 was already following his father around the cattle operation with the focused attention of someone learning a trade, and Elvira at 1.5 had the look of her grandmother Elvira Norris in the dark eyes and the determined set of the small chin. A third child came in 1890, another son, James, named for Henry's lost brother, which Henry had suggested quietly, and which Elvira had accepted with the understanding of what it meant. James was darker than Thomas and louder than Elvira, and showed from his earliest months an extraordinary interest in animals that led to a lifelong bond with every creature on the property, starting with Clara the border collie, who was elderly by then but still alert enough to recognize a fellow spirit. The years of the early 1890s on the Kansas frontier were not without difficulty for anyone. The drought years of 1890 and 1891 hit the wheat hard and the cattle suffered, and there were families across the county who left, unable to hold on, loading their wagons and moving back east with a defeat written in their faces that Elvira recognized and grieved for. They survived it by having been careful, by the diversification of the farm, by the cattle income, by the reserves they'd built in the good years, and by the mutual support of the community they'd become part of, the Bradleys and the Hartmans and a dozen other families along the Cimarron who shared what they had and held on together. Henry was elected to the Caldwell Township Board of Directors in 1892, which he accepted with the same straightforward seriousness he brought to everything, and which Elvira supported because she believed in civic participation, and because having Henry on the board meant that the interests of the small landholders in the district had at least one voice that was genuinely committed to them. She herself became the person that new homesteaders, particularly women homesteading alone, who were more common than the popular image of the frontier would suggest, came to for advice. She kept her records and her experience organized and available, and she gave it freely, because the injustice of the trust's tactics had shown her what happened to people who faced those systems without information or support, and she was not willing to stand by while it happened to others when she had something to offer. By 1895, the Sutton Norris farm on the Cimarron was one of the most productive small operations in the county. Not the largest, they had never aimed for largest, but reliable and diversified and managed with the kind of long-term thinking that made it sustainable. The wheat acres had expanded to 12. The cattle operation was modest but profitable. The kitchen garden supplied the family and a regular surplus that went to the Caldwell market. The chickens, descended from the original dozen Bradley's hens, were a small empire that Elvira, at 7, considered her personal domain. Elvira was 38 years old, which the calendar confirmed but which her body mostly ignored. She was still lean and strong, and the auburn hair had a few threads of gray at the temples that she did not mind. Henry at 43 had the settled, solid presence of a man who had found his place and was deeply content in it, which sat on him with a warmth that she found more attractive than the cautious, guarded man she had found at the river 12 years before. They had arguments occasionally, because they were both people of strong opinion and neither of them had softened into accommodation. The arguments were always about specific, real things: the fence, the cattle rotation, the children's education, the township board's decisions, and they always resolved them by talking, because they had both learned that the alternative was carrying things that got heavier, and neither of them was willing to carry anything unnecessarily. On an evening in the fall of 1895, they sat again by the fire in the good chairs. The chairs had been reupholstered twice by now, with the sounds of the house around them. Thomas, 11, was doing his reading at the kitchen table. Elvira, 7, was in bed and theoretically asleep, but from the light under her door was almost certainly playing with her collection of small carved animals. James, 5, was genuinely asleep, having spent the entire day in energetic communion with the farm animals, and arrived at bedtime too exhausted to even request the usual story. Clara had died the previous spring at the remarkable age of 14, a good long life for a border collie, and they had buried her at the edge of the property near the old bank revetment, where the willow stakes they'd planted in that first week had grown into actual willow trees, substantial and graceful along the Cimarron edge. Henry had taken it harder than he'd expected, which she had not mentioned because it was unnecessary. There was a new dog, a young border collie named Cap, who was James's especial companion, and he was asleep now by the fire in the place Clara had always occupied, which felt like both a continuity and a new beginning. "I want to ask you something," Henry said. She looked at him over her coffee. "Are you happy?" he asked. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," she said. "Not the simple kind, the complicated kind with full understanding of everything that went into getting here." He nodded slowly. "That's the kind that holds," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." She reached across the space between the chairs and took his hand, the way she had the first time in the Wichita restaurant 12 years ago, and he laced his fingers through hers with the ease of long habit and deep rightness. Outside, the Cimarron moved through the dark Kansas night past the willow trees, and the winter wheat and the good bottomland soil that she had known from the first was excellent, and had come to know through years of working it as something finer than excellent as hers, as theirs, as the ground of everything they had become. The stars above the prairie came out in their millions, unobscured and extraordinary, and in the warm house on the land they had fought for and won and loved and built upon, the lamp burned steady as a promise kept, and Elvira Norris, who had come to a land office in Caldwell, Kansas, in 1883 with $60 and a dream and a fury that could have cut glass, and found a man's name in the ledger beside hers, and ridden south to fight him, and arrived instead at something she had not planned and could not have imagined, and would not trade for anything the world had to offer, sat with her husband's hand in hers, and listened to her children breathe and felt, beneath all the complexity and weight and beauty of a life fully lived, the simple and sufficient truth of it. She was home. She had made it, and everything her father had sent her here to find was exactly here.